We now reach the third part of Hume's criticism of the claims that the soul is immortal. In part 3, he looks at the physical arguments, and Hume contended that there are only 3 ways to argue for the immortality of the soul: the metaphysical, which he, to his satisfaction, has refuted; the moral, which also to his satisfaction he has refuted; and lastly, physical arguments, which he believes that, of course, he will refute. So the physical arguments go like this. He claims that physical arguments from the analogy of nature are strong, not for the immortality of the soul, but for the soul's mortality. And he claims, without really supporting it, that these are the only philosophical arguments admissible regarding this question, or any question of fact. Now this does, of course, tie back to his view that any questions about existence are questions that must be addressed empirically with a posteriori arguments, and hence he does defend this view in other places. So how does he present what he regards as the physical arguments to counter the notion the soul is immortal? Well, his first argument can be called the sleep argument, which goes like this. Put kind of generically, if objects A and B are connected, so alterations in A correspond to proportional alterations in B, then if greater alterations in A totally dissolve A, then total dissolution of B follows. That's kind of his generic setup. The idea essentially is if two objects are interconnected so that affecting one affects the other proportionally, totally destroying one totally destroys the other. So how does this tie into sleep? Well, Hume notes that sleep, which is a very small effect, is attended with temporary extinction, or at least great confusion in the soul. So Hume is most likely implying that if sleep has such an effect on the soul, then death will dissolve the soul. Next argument is the proportion argument. Hume claims that when people are infants, the weakness of their body, the weakness of their mind are proportional. And as people grow up, the vigor of their mind, the vigor of their body are in correlation, are in proportion. But then, as people develop, sickness and grow older, that the vigor of their body and mind starts to decline. And he draws the obvious conclusion that the further step seems unavoidable, their dissolution in death. So his idea essentially is that since the mind and body interact, that in the sleep argument, if sleep affects the body and the mind, then the dissolution of the body would destroy the mind as well. And the proportion argument is that we start off proportionally weak mentally and physically, reach our peak, and then decline, and then he concludes death would destroy both. He then heads on to more arguments, being as thorough as he can be. The conditional argument is this, and it's an argument by analogy, in which he's comparing things and contending that because things are like in certain ways, they're like in this other way. And he says, by analogy of nature, no form can continue when transferred to a condition very different from its original. Trees perish in water, although some trees can survive okay. Fishes die in air, although, again, some fishes, like lungfish, can. And animals die in the earth. These, generalizing, obviously, because there are some exceptions. And he does note that even a difference of climate is often fatal. So he sets up the analogy in the following way, that in general, when animals are in environments that they're not suited to at all, that are inimical to them, they typically die. So, could an immense alteration on the soul by its body dissolution occur without dissolving the whole? And Hume thinks that everything is common between soul and body, and the existence of one depends on the other. So by analogy, just as a fish out of water perishes, the soul out of the body perishes as well. Now, like with any analogy, Like any analogy, this is assessed by three standards. First, are the two things being compared, do they share enough properties? Secondly, are the similarities relevant? And thirdly, are there any relevant dissimilarities that would weaken or break the analogy? And so kind of the core question is the soul in the body like a fish is in water? And to the degree that is plausible, the analogy is a strong one. To the degree that it is not, it would be a weak analogy. So the obvious dispute is over that comparison. He then turns to the souls of animals again, bringing them in each of his three arguments. So again, he's going after people who claim that the souls of animals are mortal or that animals don't have souls at all. And so he's presenting an argument by analogy here. The people he's arguing against claim that animals are mortal. Either they don't have souls or their souls perish. Hume argues by analogy that since the souls of animals are like the souls of humans, that this is a very strong argument. And he further, reinforces it by noting that, we draw analogies between the bodies of animals and humans, and when we do a comparative anatomy, people accept those analogies. And so he argues by analogy, kind of a double analogy, that we should accept the analogical comparison between human souls and animal souls, that if animal souls are mortal, so too are those of humans. Now, of course, one could reply by saying there's relevant dissimilarities, which is an argument Descartes makes, or alternatively, a person could simply accept that, okay, humans have immortal souls, animals are like us, so, all good dogs go to heaven kind of scenario, that animals have immortal souls. Then Hume presses on more. He presents his change argument, and he notes, kind of following our good dead friend Heraclitus, who said the world is fire, in the sense that it both literally, that fire makes up everything, but also metaphorically, and that everything changes. Hume notes that everything is in continual flux and change, and the world shows symptoms of frailty and dissolution. And so he reasons by analogy. If everything in the world is in perpetual flux, everything is changing, and everything fails and dissolves, it would be what you would expect by analogy is that everything in it, would fail as well. That if all these other things fail and dissolve, then the soul, which is, frail and subject to great disorders, would seem likely to be mortal and dissolvable. So his argument essentially is, given that the universe everything in it seems to be in flux and change and dissolving and frail, that a claim that the soul is somehow immortal and indissoluble would be contrary to this analogy, that it just wouldn't make any sense. His next argument is the infinite number of souls argument. Kind of a somewhat sarcastic argument, but also one that kind of puts him ahead of his time in some ways. And he raises the following problem. How to dispose of the infinite number of posthumous existences ought to embarrass the religious theory. So what he's asserting here is essentially what about all the souls, the infinite number of them? And this is where he's kind of perhaps ahead of his time. He says every planet in every solar system could be peopled with intelligent mortal beings, aliens. And for these, he claims, a new universe must, every generation, be created beyond the bounds of the present universe. Or, alternatively, the first must be large enough for this continual influx of beings. And he says, such a bold supposition ought not to be accepted on the pretext of bare possibility. So roughly put, what he's saying is, where do all the souls go when they die? Now, there are a couple obvious counters here. One is that in many religions, they have, heaven and hell. So they don't stay here, they go somewhere else. And you could, in theory, have an infinite heaven or infinite hell. A second possible reply is that thinkers who accept the soul, such as Descartes, claim that matter is extended, but the soul is not. It's immaterial. It's incorporeal. So it has no volume to it, no extension. And so if a soul occupies no space, you could have an infinite number of them in no space at all. So there would be no problem storing all the souls, so to speak. But it's kind of Hume's lack of argument. So he raises the question, is everyone who ever existed now alive? And he says no one can think of a scrutiny of nature will furnish argument strong enough to answer yes. And so he says there's no argument without divine revelation, and this establishes the negative claim that this is not the case. Now the obvious reply to this is there are lots of philosophers who argued for immortality. So for him to claim there's no argument would be somewhat disingenuous, certainly not the case. Now, he could, of course, contend there are no good arguments, but that's another matter. He then turns to the insensibility argument. And this is something he raised earlier in the metaphysical part, which was this. Our insensibility before birth seems proof of a like state after dissolution. So essentially he's raising the question, if you have no recollection of what occurred before birth, why would you think there's anything happening after death? Now, of course, there are ways to counter this. There are those who do claim to have memories from previous existence. And philosophers dating back to Plato and religious thinkers dating way back have argued that reincarnation does occur, but people, forget as part of the process. There's always something that, conveniently erases people's memories before they're reborn. One could also argue, of course, that there isn't reincarnation. So your soul exists forever, but you go, as he said, you go to heaven or hell or wherever after you die, and so you don't get reborn. So you wouldn't have any recollections of a past life, because none of us have a past life. We just, appear and then go to heaven or hell. Now, of course, this runs afoul of his argument that he claims that whatever cannot be destroyed cannot be created, so we've been around forever. But that could be replied to against, that God either, creates a fresh batch of souls, constantly, or that they're created once and just kind of stored until they're used. Which both sound, kind of odd that he's constantly creating souls or has like a big soul warehouse. But if you accept the existence of souls, the material entities, etc., that are immortal, then the idea that they're all created at once, or that they are created as needed, doesn't seem particularly problematic. Then he keeps on going. Now, one argument that people have advanced for immortality is this, that nature does nothing in vain, and so if there's something that we want, that we really, really want, then we can get it. It doesn't give us qualities that are, impossible to fulfill. Now, they're careful, of course, to point out that this doesn't mean that, for example, that if someone really wants to be, a billionaire, that they can become a billionaire. It's kind of a more general thing. So, yes, obviously, people's desires are thwarted constantly, but the idea is that in general, we have these, desires that in general can be fulfilled. So he puts it the following way. If our horrors of annihilation were an original passion, not an effect of our love of happiness, that was one of my dogs, in case you're wondering where that strange noise was, this would prove the soul's mortality. As nature does nothing in vain, she would not give us a horror against an impossible event. But Hume notes, she may give us a horror against an unavoidable event if our endeavors, as in this case, may postpone it. He claims that death is unavoidable, yet we would not be preserved without a natural aversion towards it. And he notes that all doctrines favored by our passions are to be suspected, and the hopes and fears which give rise to this doctrine are very obvious. So what's going on there? Well, again, there are those who claim that, okay, we really want to be immortal. Nature does not give us desires that cannot be fulfilled. Again, in general, because we obviously have lots of desires that do not get fulfilled. And we want, immortality, so we got to have it. Got to exist. Hume's counter to this is, well, we might have a horror against death and want to keep on going, but his claim is not that this proves immortality, it's that we just have a natural aversion to death. And essentially he's giving kind of a evolutionary argument to it. If we did not have an aversion towards death, we'd go extinct. If people just like, hey, I don't care about death, no fear of death, and just didn't avoid anything, humans would go extinct pretty quickly. He also puts in the notion that it's that people hope that there's an afterlife, and essentially wishful thinking. And he kind of implies that we shouldn't accept things just because we feel really strongly about them. And so what he's implying is it's wishful thinking to think that we really want an afterlife, so there's gotta be one. Then he turns to defending a negative, and he claims that defending the negative provides a great advantage. And in cases where the question is out of the common experience course of nature, he claims it is almost always decisive. Now, what he's in a way kind of referring to here is that in general, if someone claims it's something unusual that's, again, out of the common experience course of nature, that it's generally much easier to defend a negative claim. There is not such a thing. And the burden of proof is on those who claim there is such a thing. Now, as you might imagine, there's considerable debate in critical thinking and philosophy who gets the burden of proof, and there's actually a fallacy called burden of proof, where the burden of proof is put on the wrong side. And as you would probably suspect, people always want to stick the burden of proof on the other side, because that way, if the other side can't disprove your point, you just win. Provides a huge advantage. So the question is, who's got to do the proving? Now, it's generally argued and generally accepted in philosophy that when people claim something unusual exists, like ghosts or other metaphysical entities, the burden is on them. So Hume essentially is claiming that if you say there's no immortality, that gives you, defending that negative gives you an advantage. Because what people have to do is they have to prove it. They just can't say, we assume immortality, it has to be rather proven. And that's the other dog shaking, of course, in front of the microphone. So he thinks that a new logic and new faculties of the mind to grasp this will be needed. So rather similar to what he says about the problem of evil. He's not saying definitely no immortality. His claim is that we would need a special logic to do this. And he closes either sarcastically or seriously. One suspects sarcastically. He says this shows the infinite obligations which humanity has to divine revelation, since no other medium could ascertain this. So you could take this, a couple ways. One is, oh yes, you know this through revelation. Or, of course, the more sarcastic way would be, yeah, the only way you're going to know there's immortality is, divine revelation. And so, again, he does close with, in a way, skepticism. He doesn't say there definitely is no immortality. His argument concludes with all the arguments for it that he considers all fail. And so there are no good reasons to believe that we have it, and many good reasons to believe that we do not. And next, we'll turn to our good dead friend Immanuel Kant, who claimed that reading Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumbers.